And as we discuss these weighty issues so many of you live through, we have someone who heads the agency. Craig Fugate is Administrator of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, probably after Katrina the most maligned federal bureaucracy in history after that. So it's very good to be with you, Craig, today. But many of us, if you look back, as I did, and sort of look at the press coverage of FEMA, its administrator during that time, and the issue, the first thing that, in terms of doing a historical look at this, is what went so wrong? Why did it go so wrong?
Well, I think, there's a lot of people who want to focus on an individual. I've been in this business for a while. We've seen this pattern over and over again. The nation prepares for what we think can happen, and when something worse happens, we're not ready for it. And it doesn't start with Katrina. It goes back to Hurricane Andrew. It goes back to Hurricane Hugo. It goes back to the Loma Prieta earthquake. It's this tendency that we plan for what we are capable of doing, not what can happen. And then we hope things scale up. There was no real mystery what could happen here in New Orleans. We actually had the National Hurricane Conference here that year in April talking about many of these risks. FEMA had participated in an exercise with the state called Hurricane Pam that simulated these things. We talked about them. The challenge was if you cannot execute and you don't plan for what can happen.
So you had a discussion before Katrina hit in April of that year that basically simulated out what might happen.
And we looked at worse things. Yeah. A major hurricane coming up the river channel, overflowing the mainline levee system, and what that would look like. So it was not that we didn't know New Orleans was one of the more vulnerable areas.
Right.
But it was, if you looked at a lot of the plans, they would plan for what had happened in the past, what people thought was reasonable to plan for. Mother Nature's not reasonable. And so what you had was everybody thought, well, if it's worse than that, we'll just scale up. And it didn't. And there was also a very disjointed response in that you have what I call, each level of government was like dominoes having to fail before the next level would kick in. And there was too much delay.
So explain what that means, the domino of how action was triggered, say in the case of Katrina. What were the failures, as the triggering dominoes of requests came in? What when it came to your agency, why did it mobilize so late?
It goes back to how we're structured. Most disasters, small ones, are handled by local government every day. Maybe the governor calls out the guard. That's the typical response. Occasionally, it will get to the level where the governor will now request from the president and they need assistance, and the request comes up, and then FEMA acts upon that at the direction of the president. That day-to-day works probably for small floods, small tornadoes. It doesn't work in large-scale disasters. And so the tendency was each level was planning, responding, and then waiting to get to the next level. And I'm not saying FEMA wasn't doing things ahead of time, but the way we had set up our structure was each level of government's got to make the formal request to the next level to get the assistance. Congress actually recognized this in the Post-Katrina Reform Act and said, if we think it's bad and the governor's likely to be needing help, why do we have to wait for them to ask for help to start moving? Because the thing you lose in disasters you never get back is time. It isn't so much the lack of resources, it's the decisions being made that you're going to commit resources, that you have to make those quickly. You may not have assessments. You may not have formal requests. But if you wait till people know how bad it is, you lose time. And you never get time back. And unlike other hazards, we see hurricanes coming. So what we have learned and what we've done in this administration is we're not waiting for storms to get close or make landfall or for governors to make requests. We start planning as how bad can it be, are we moving the resources, and get them there in time. It doesn't mean we're taking over. The governor may not ultimately need those resources. But time is the one aspect of response you never get back. So you need to be planning for what could happen, not what you're prepared to do. And then move quickly without waiting for all the facts. You can't wait for request. The levee's broke. At that point, you need a search and rescue. If that's when a request is coming up, you're 24 to 72 hours before resources across the nation can move. So it's the understanding that you go by what could happen, not what you're prepared to do. When you see something developing, you plan upon those worst case scenarios. We're not in the business of hope. We have to plan for worst case.
I just want to tell the audience I spent some time with the administrator a little while ago, and he's the most pleasant gloom and doom guy you could have at a dinner table.
Yeah.
But it occurred to me, just looking at your profile, you've been in disaster preparedness, disaster recovery all your life, thinking about these issues. And I read in 2011 you oversaw 87 emergency responses. You were made famous for overseeing Hurricanes Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean in Florida, the 4 and 04. And so this is part of your DNA. And both President Bush, whom Mitch Landrieu just mentioned, and President Obama both wanted you to come in. So you're seen as the disaster guy by just about everyone. What did you think was wrong with FEMA when you came in? What were the big things you set out to change in the way we respond? What is the difference today in the DNA of FEMA under you than what we had under Michael Brown?
Think big, go fast, be smart about it.
And so by implication, none of those were the case before?
They were so afraid of making decisions for being wrong, having to have information. In between big disasters, we as a nation then want to look at how do we reduce cost. Because getting ready and responding to disasters is not cheap. So when you don't have big disasters, there's always the budget consideration. Well, this is going to cost a lot of money to have all this capability. Do we really need it on all of these other challenges? So what if we cut here? What if we cut there? You got in more trouble at FEMA, it seemed like, to make the wrong decision than you did to just act. So you got paralysis where people were so fearful of being wrong, they would wait till they had enough information to get to the right answer. I said, well, you don't have time to get to the right answer. You go with the best answer you have with the information. So the lesson I'd learned, and actually I went through this, we used to wait until a disaster happened and then try to assess how bad it was before we would respond. And that's why we used to say, first 72 hours, it's going to take that long to know how bad it is before you do the assessment. So I'm like, why are we waiting 72 hours to find out it's bad? If it's a Category 3 hurricane, hitting Punta Gorda, Hurricane Charlie, why don't we assume it's bad? Well, that's not how the system was set up. I'm like, well, the system's insane. We're changing it. And I'm like, if you have a major hurricane about to make landfall, you better be ready to respond, not when the locals say it's bad, but when the winds die low enough where you can start moving. Speed is key. If you're going to change outcomes, speed is key. And you've got to have the resources based upon the population at risk. This is not rocket science. This is, you got a risk, you got a population, you got impacts. And with a hurricane, unlike an earthquake, we see it coming. It doesn't mean there's not going to be tragedy. It doesn't mean there's not going to be damages. And unfortunately, it won't mean we won't have loss of life. But it should not be a mystery that we have to wait for somebody to do an assessment before we respond. So the lessons I learned in 04, speed was key. And the more time you wait to find out how bad it is, the less you're going to change the outcome. Respond like it's bad. You can always go down and reduce. You don't scale up, you don't get time back. And I think the thing that I kind of hammer in FEMA over and over and over again is we never get time back. If we think it's bad before the governor even makes a formal request to the president, if it's a response, we need to be moving. A lot of disasters are about helping financially recover. And since we do that most of the time, our systems tended to gravitate around that. We wait for the request, we do the assessments, we determine it exceeds the state's capability. But that's about financial reimbursements, right? It's about rebuilding after disaster. That model doesn't work in a response. But if your system is built around what you do most of the time, that's what you're going to do when you have the Katrina. So you have to change that and build for what the mission is, which is being able to move quickly with little information based upon as best you can with model and probability of impacts. And you can always scale back, but you never get time back.
One of the impressions that people have, and I can feel it just seeing the media coverage of the 10th anniversary of Katrina, talking to people here today, is a sense that the kind of resources you direct help out the rich white communities and leave behind those that are disadvantaged, those who are in other parts of the community, that there is not a fair distribution or an effective distribution that covers the population. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Anybody hear what the maximum amount of FEMA assistance is eligible to somebody in a disaster? It goes up by consumer price index, but the total amount's about $32,000. To get that $32,000, you have to have uninsured losses, meaning you weren't covered with either flood insurance or your homeowner's policy. You also have to fail a means test in that the next level of assistance is a low-interest loan from the Small Business Administration. If you don't qualify for the SBA, meaning you don't have the ability to pay it back, then you may be eligible for FEMA grants. FEMA grants were not designed to make people whole, although there's a lot of people who come in afterwards and the disaster and say, FEMA's here, we're going to make everybody better. FEMA was really designed to do the initial response and start the process. That's why it's so important when, the mayor was talking about all the billions that have come to the city. That's not FEMA dollars he's talking about. Ours is a piece of that. You're talking about housing and community development dollars to deal with housing issues. Because I know of no community that did not have a housing issue before a disaster that got better just because you had a hurricane or an earthquake. We don't deal with the job situation. We don't deal with the unemployment situation and education and high school dropout rate. We don't fix the pre-existing conditions. And our programs were never designed to solve that on the back end. Ours is like the initial response to get somebody some help, get somebody a place to live, get them some initial assistance. But Congress never built FEMA to make people whole. So your analogy that we go to the rich white and not the poor blacks, actually the poor get the most help from FEMA because they don't qualify for loans, they didn't have insurance. But poverty is one of the single biggest factors of impact and disasters of not being able to recover. The other thing we had was a middle class that were middle class because of the home ownership.
Right.
When they lost their homes, they were no longer middle class. So if you got the wealth, you can weather disasters better than the poor. That's just a fact of life. Because the way our programs are designed at FEMA, we don't exist to pre-existing conditions and we're not going to make people whole. We are designed to be a bridge. And that's why it's so important that one of the things that Congress directed us to do, and under President Obama we've looked at, is if you only look at FEMA programs and the type of Katrina response we dealt with, communities won't recover. Because you have to look at the community's needs as a whole. And FEMA's got a small piece in that. What we've now been asked to do is to coordinate among the acronym of federal agencies of all the programs we've been putting together and go, are we addressing the underlying issues? Is there going to be affordable housing? Is there going to be jobs? Is the education system going to be such? Because people left because the schools weren't coming back. There was no place to stay. It wasn't safe in many areas. And if you want people back, you got to have a place to live you can afford. You have to have a job, right? You have to have a school system that you're willing to put your kids in. And so as the mayor's talking about these things, these are the things that you have to establish. But we did not, as a federal government, sit together in the aftermath of Katrina with a blueprint to work with the state and local governments on how to do that. It was kind of ad hoc. And we missed too many opportunities early in that response. I mean, we're at 10 years. And we are still working on resolving issues with the city over water and sewage. This is 10 years later.
I mean, you've said that Katrina is not a closed operation. It
still
remains
ongoing.
open. You've just opened up. So hundreds of thousands of claims could potentially come back and be reviewed in flood insurance and other areas. You were telling me something back in the green room was very interesting about how you thought FEMA had long made a mistake of competing with the private sector during responses. And you had this wonderful thing called the Waffle House Index. Should you give us sort of a 45-second or 1 minute, frame of the Waffle House Index per Craig Fugate?
Well, I drive back and forth between Florida and New Orleans. I got family here, so you knew every intersection you were going past was a Waffle House. And in Florida, in the 04 hurricanes, what we started observing was if there was anything open at that interchange, no matter if the power was out, it was going to be a Waffle House. I didn't really know this because I wasn't speaking for the company, but we just came up with this index. If the Waffle House is open, it's not that bad, keep going. Because remember what I said, we weren't waiting for the locals to tell it was bad, we're just going to start responding. Well, where are you responding to? And so we would start driving in these areas, and if the Waffle House was still open, I'd tell the search and rescue teams, keep going, it's not that bad. But if the Waffle House is closed, start looking around, because if the Waffle House is closed, it's pretty bad. But it goes back to this idea that we try to solve problems, like responding to Katrina, with what I call a government-centric approach to problem solving. You got a disaster, you got challenges, government's going to solve all those problems. We tended to look at the private sector, somebody we'd contract with, and we actually would get in competition with them. We'd be putting out food, water, and supplies in areas that stores were trying to open, killing their business. And so we found that perhaps a better way was to sit down with the private sector and go, why don't we look at this as a team? And if you can get open and you serve an area, let's go where you're not. Because what will tend to happen is where is there any place in the city that still is underserved by grocery stores? Mm-hmm. So if I'm planning on where I'm going to put out food and water, shouldn't I plan for those areas first?
Absolutely.
Instead of where the stores are? And then if I'm working with the stores and asking them, what will it take to get you open? Do you need a generator? Do you need debris picked up? You need security? Because if I can get them open, and they tend to be in those more affluent communities where people can't afford.
Right.
So it was this idea that in these really big disasters, there's not enough government.
So you've turned that on its head.
Yeah. It's like quit trying to solve problems with just government and go look at the private sector as part of the team and go, if we work together, why are we competing with you and going where you can already get open? Because if you're open in those areas, then you can meet those needs. We need to go where you're not or you cannot get open. And it goes from the big box stores, it goes to the drug stores, it goes down to the local businesses. Because this is the other horror story that most people don't talk about in disasters, is how many small businesses get wiped out and never come back.
Right.
They don't have the resiliency, they don't have the depth, and they cannot go long periods of time with the disruptions. And so the quicker we can get back in communities and get them going, one of the things we adopted, and we actually got this after we supported the response to Haiti, was the need for the federal government to buy local and hire local. Putting people to work, use local businesses, because we tend to bring everybody from the outside. And that may be necessary in the beginning, but at some point, if stores are opening locally, why aren't you buying there? Why aren't you hiring locally? Again, these are temporary jobs. They're only going to be for short periods of time.
But they kickstart.
They kickstart. And if people are displaced while they're waiting for the schools to open or their jobs to come back, it's income. But it means you've got to turn around and stop thinking about, okay, we're big federal government. We're going to come in here. We know everything. We're going to do everything, and we have all the resources. No. We weren't doing it the day before the disaster. What made us smart enough to think we're going to do it the day after the disaster? So we call this the whole community, which was basically Emergency Management 101, which was not the result of Katrina. It's what we were teaching all the way back when I got into the business.
So let me ask you the same question Jeff Goldberg asked Mayor Landrieu, which is if you had rolling into town and the region a disastrous hurricane on scale of Katrina, how do you think the contours of that would look like in terms of emergency response? What would we not be talking about today, after that, given the changes you've made in the agency?
I would hope we would not see the loss of life, but the giving is we will lose people. We would still have the damages. But I think what you'd see differently is less of this sense of we don't know how bad it is, we don't know what we're doing. It may legitimately be there's just not enough stuff to get there fast enough because that's just the way it is. There's finite resources, but it should not be because we're waiting to find out how bad it is. We didn't assume it's that bad, or we only built systems designed for our everyday business model. So I think you'd see a much different response. Again, you'll never be able to answer this question until you have another Katrina-sized storm. Is it better? But our experiences during Sandy, during Irene, remember Isaac?
Oh, yeah.
River parishes had no idea how bad they could get hit, remember? Because they said, well, Isaac's not as big as Katrina, we're fine. And then they flooded. We saw that here in Orleans Parish, they did well, and the levee helped. But the surge on Lake Pontchartrain in a weaker storm was actually worse on the river parishes. It was not an issue, was FEMA not here? We were here. Wasn't on the scale of that. But the thing we try to reemphasize time and time again is you have to collapse the dominoes. The locals, the states, and the feds have to work as one team. We can't wait till it's too late to show up. And the other thing is you have to base your scale upon the level of impact and respond as if it's going to be bad, and then you hope it isn't. But hope in my world is not an effective strategy. You plan and activate and respond as it can be as bad as it is.
You really remind me of Herman Kahn thinking the unthinkable. The disaster guy in American history was always thinking about nuclear holocaust and others. But when you look in the arena of natural disaster that would need emergency response, you said Katrina was fully predictable, everything was on the table, where it was hit, how communities would be hit was on the table, and it's stupid to say that we couldn't have been better prepared for that. So as you look forward today at the country, what are the top 2 or 3 horrible disasters out there waiting to happen that you worry about?
The Cascadia subduction zone off the coast of Oregon State and Washington and Northern California. It's been getting press lately, but we've been working on this since I got in office. We know it's going to be a large-scale event if it occurs. We just don't know when.
That's earthquake and tsunami?
Yeah. Major landfall and hurricanes. Orleans has always been a dangerous area. But another area of this country most people don't think about is Norfolk, Virginia. That area is very vulnerable to storm surge, very dense population, and they have a very similar situation. Their traffic is a nightmare to try to evacuate that area. Miami, Houston, even New York City from tropical storms. Major earthquakes, New Madrid, the central U.S. The thing is, in most cases, we know where the hazards are, we know what the vulnerabilities are. Why are we not planning for those events? So we tend now to put our effort on what we call catastrophic disaster planning, not what we do most of the time, not what we're relatively successful at most of the time, but as a nation, what could happen, what is it going to take, and are we getting ready?
We're right near the end of our time, but I have gotten a question up here. We knew we were going to be short on time, so I do it. There is an adage that you achieve what you measure. According to this person, FEMA spends considerable time focusing on process, such as the National Disaster Recovery Framework, and then measuring success against fidelity to that process. Would FEMA ever consider, at least in part, measuring outcomes as impact and impact? How many families move, when they're coming back, at what cost? Do you need a different kind of measure to get more deeply into how FEMA is helping a community manage some of these disasters?
Yeah, because my staff hate me because I don't like process. I always focus on outcomes. You know what the outcome recovery you need to measure? And it's not touchy-feely, and it doesn't cover every issue that people think is important, but it's probably the single best indicator is your tax base. The local municipal tax base is probably your best indicator. Were you even remotely successful in recovering? And is your tax base going to be sustainable once the federal dollars of rebuilding are over to provide the essential services in your community? That gets to the heart of, did you get housing back? Did you get jobs back? Did you get your schools back? And it's not a perfect measure, but if you want to drive a lot of the decisions that should have been happening early on, is are we going to reestablish a sustainable tax base that once the federal dollars of rebuilding go away, you now have a stable tax base to provide the essential services and make sure you've done the basic fundamentals for future growth. Safe and secure communities, affordable housing, intact and functioning infrastructure, good schools. These are all things you put on your brochures when you want to go advertise and bring businesses to your community, right? Yet if you don't drive to that as an outcome, it's just process. And I hate process.
Thank you for answering the question. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a hand to Craig Fugate, Administrator of FEMA.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.